Chapter 2, Literature Review. History of high-stakes testing. Influence of high-stakes testing on school curriculum. The purpose of secondary, middle school, and high school education is to prepare students for higher education and future careers. Curriculum and high-stakes testing was believed to be an indicator of students' preparedness for higher education and future careers, but has instead been used to withhold funding for schools if students receive low scores on exams. Students are no longer receiving instruction in classes to prepare for higher education and future careers, since students are having difficulty meeting the objectives of the standards. Instead, students are receiving instruction intended to prepare students for standardized tests. Students are receiving instruction that emphasizes test preparation strategies in terms of how to study for tests, memorizing formulas, and how to use the process of elimination in responding to questions. As a result of emphasizing education on test preparation and funding that is dependent on test scores, students are not receiving a curriculum to meet the initial needs of school standards. The initial purpose of school standards was to have the United States be economically successful, innovative, and improve the general welfare of citizens to be qualified for future careers in higher education. State standards and high-stakes testing have not met their initial intended conceptualized purpose, which was to better prepare students for higher education and future careers. Student schools in lower economic communities receive less funding because the students do not receive high test scores. Due to students' low academic performance and low performance on standardized tests, schools require students to be placed in school tracking programs to improve students' performance. School tracking are pathways that place students on tracks based on the student's academic performance, behavior, and cognitive ability. Students can even be placed in a low-level track for erroneous reasons. An example of an erroneous reason would be that the student needed an accommodation, differentiation in the way the lesson was being taught, or further explanation of a problem in the lesson. Students who do not receive the additional assistance could instead get behind academically and be misclassified as qualifying for low-level tracking classes. Students who are placed in low-level tracking classes experience lower self-efficacy because of the stigmatization that these classes carry with them. Students that are more likely to be disadvantaged and placed in low-level tracking classes are students from low socioeconomic communities because these students do not receive adequate support to perform well academically. Since art classes are dependent on academic performance of students, these students in low economic communities are less likely to receive opportunities to continually develop self-efficacy and divergent thinking through art education. Due to time constraints in the classroom, art classes are seen as non-essential. Since art is now part of the core curriculum or part of the standardized tests, more time is allocated in classrooms to subjects that will be on the high-stakes tests. Students that are in tracking classes are put into low-level tracks until the students are able to perform well enough to move into general education tracks or advanced tracks. Even if the students were moved to higher-level tracks, the schools that students attend still might not offer an art class at the middle school level. School tracking has been a key component in the education system. Students move through the educational system on different tracks based on their ability to perform academically. Some students are able to perform at higher levels academically and are placed in general education or advanced tracks, while other students can be placed in low-level tracks. The education track of a student has traditionally determined the long-term socioeconomic status of an individual. The higher the education, the higher the socioeconomic status that the individual has the potential to obtain. A student's academic performance is measured based on scores on in-class assignments, homework, quizzes, in-class tests, and standardized tests. A student's academic performance does not factor in the student's engagement during the time of instruction. A student could potentially perform lower academically if the student is simply not engaged during the time of instruction. As a result of a student not being engaged during instruction, a student can be mistakenly placed in a low-level class track. Some low-level school tracks are stigmatized, which can cause a student to feel out of place, making it more difficult for a student to stay engaged to reclassify into general education. School tracking has the potential to affect the level of education that students receive, the education that students' parents receive, along with the class and income of families. Tracking can affect the programs and curriculum that schools implement or programs and curriculum that is available to students. One of the key causes of achievement gap has been school tracking. As a result of tracking, there has been lack of differentiation in the way that students are taught with the intention of preparing students for high-stakes testing. High-stakes testing's impact on the achievement gap. One of the key causes of achievement gap has been school tracking. An achievement gap occurs in testing when low-income communities of color have fewer resources to prepare for high-stakes tests, thereby creating a gap in the scores of low-income communities of color when compared to more affluent communities in the U.S. As a result of the difference of income, students that live in low-income communities continue to earn low test scores, while students in affluent communities continue to receive higher test scores. Qualitative research conducted in California by Grodsky found that the difference in parents' socioeconomic status was influenced by the standardized test scores that the adults received as students. The scores earned on standardized tests used for college and graduate admissions were crucial determinants of the adult socioeconomic income in the study. Grodsky used data from the National Assessment of Education Progress gathered by the United States Department of Education. Grodsky examined parents' reading and math scores when they were 13 years old to determine if there was a relationship between the scores of the students and the income that they received as adults. Grodsky found that the reading and math achievements remained unchanged between 1984 and 2004 for adults that did not attend college. In contrast, students that were college educated performed higher by 30 points during that same period. Grodsky suggests that gaps in scores for standardized tests increase with individuals from low socioeconomic backgrounds. Title I funding is supposed to substitute for the differences in parent income. However, achievement gaps continue to exist while funding and resources of public schools are partially dependent on high-stakes test performance. Funding and resources of public schools are partially dependent on high-stakes test performance. Schools that perform better on high-stakes tests receive more funding, while schools that perform poorly on high-stakes tests receive less funding and resources. Low-income communities lack the funding and resources needed to inform these parents in low-income communities that they have the right to opt out of the high-stakes tests. In more affluent communities, principals and teachers had open forums that informed parents of their right to opt out of high-stakes tests. As a result of the Serrano versus Priest case and Proposition 13 in California, affluent communities voted to place a cap on the amount that they were taxed. The reasoning for the cap was that affluent communities wanted the taxes that they paid to go towards the schools that were in the affluent communities. Affluent families did not want their taxes to go toward funding low-income communities that needed additional services and resources to make education equitable. Families in more affluent communities are able to afford the additional services and programs to better prepare their students for high-stakes tests, with or without the provided funding. Affluent communities have an economic advantage that allow for the students to continue to receive funding for programs. Low-income communities do not have the same economic advantage as affluent communities, and low-income communities depend on government funding to continue school programs. The education that students receive is reflective of the economic status of the communities that the students live in. Low-income communities of color are less likely to know that they have the right to opt out of high-stakes tests and prevent the negative effects of school tracking. Sackett researched whether the education that students receive is a strong determinant of an individual's social status and that the education that is received is responsible for college admissions in California. The study researched whether the scholastic assessment test scores affect the level of education and social class of students and the students' parents. The study included data from secondary schools, the socioeconomic status from 143,606 students at 110 colleges, and SAT scores. The study concluded that parental socioeconomic status and SAT scores were significant factors of determining college admissions. A separate study in Texas found that a family's socioeconomic status and parents' education level affected the opportunities that are available to their children in the future. To further show how an art education can potentially counter the negative effects of testing, Ajumo explains how relevant art approaches benefit students in low socioeconomic communities. Ajumo studied how an art program in low-income communities had an impact on students when the content was relevant to the student's community. The participants in the study included participants who were between 5 to 16 years old, with 98% of the students African American and 2% white. The research methodology conducted over a 10-year study were participant observations using themes and interviews. Findings from the Ajumo study showed that art programs improved the critical consciousness, self-empowerment, social awareness, and activism of both the learners in the program and the community that experienced the effects of social reproduction. The study also found that the involvement of students in the community art program enhanced participants' self-esteem, pride in the community, and the enthusiasm for participating in future community projects. Students' perceptions of high-stakes testing. The purpose of the qualitative analysis research conducted by Campos Holland was to examine how students of color experience and perceive standardized tests. The study's design and the methodology included semi-structured interviews with 73 youth participants. The study sample included 34 girls and 39 boys whose ages ranged from 13 to 18 in 6th through 12th grade in the United States. The study's findings were based on the perceptions that the students had of standardized tests when the interviews were conducted. The students' perceptions varied across grade level and with students that attended 61 schools that ranged from magnet, charter, technical, and community schools. The study's results showed that students were experiencing testing overload, under conflicting adult authorities, and within an academically stratified youth peer culture on an ever-shifting policy terrain. Students found that standardized tests were beginning to have an increased difficulty in addition to the use of technology that they were unfamiliar with. Other students found that the tests were not relevant because they discovered that the exams were asking similar questions and became repetitive. Adults who were administering the test of the students noticed that the students were finishing portions of the test in 5 minutes, even though the test was designed to take approximately 45 minutes. In the study, students described the results as, the use of test scores to determine youth's educational opportunities was unjust and potentially harmful to their academic journeys. Perceptions of art caused by high-stakes testing. If students do not perform well in standardized tests, the schools did not receive funding for programs that were not considered part of the core curriculum, and classes such as art were reduced. The perception that led up to the reduction of art classes is that students do not need art to prepare for tests, and one art class is sufficient for students to graduate from high school in California. Some middle schools in California have eliminated art classes to implement other programs believed to help students perform higher on high-stakes tests. An emphasis in schools has been placed on core classes such as mathematics, science, English, and history that students are being assessed on in the high-stakes tests, while art has been newly eliminated within schools in California. There is a perception in the United States that students do not need art. This perception has been created with the goal of the United States using high-stakes testing to measure student academic success. Students' academic success is supposed to be a measurement of how prepared students are for higher education and future careers. Students are supposed to be prepared to take high-stakes testing through the curriculum based on state standards that students are taught. The viewpoint of corporations, politicians, and lawmakers have instead been focused on students' scores on high-stakes tests and not the overarching goal of preparing students for higher education and future careers. The corporations, politicians, and lawmakers are correct when they say that students do not need art to prepare for tests, but they are not asking if art is preparing students for higher education and future careers. There has been data that shows that as the U.S. continues to be dependent on high-stakes testing to assess the performance of student learning, students are not performing better on state assessments, nor is the U.S. outperforming other countries in reading, writing, and math. Even if art not benefiting students on high-stakes tests was a valid argument, there have been studies that show that art has the potential to increase students' achievement in other disciplines by creating high-order learning processes by utilizing Bloom's taxonomy and Webb's depth of knowledge. Art also has the potential to be interdisciplinary and uses multiple intelligences for students' academic achievement. To address the methods of standardized testing that contribute to negative experiences of students, I draw on the frameworks of critical pedagogy and critical race theory. The literature will examine the experiences of an art teacher implementing art education with creative learning principles to cultivate students' creative self-efficacy and divergent thinking at one middle school in the Inland Empire located in Southern California. Ideally, the results of the study could be used by educational leaders to integrate more art education classes into the school curriculum to cultivate students' creative self-efficacy and divergent thinking. Students who experience art education with creative learning principles that incorporates designing, creating, critiquing interpersonal and intrapersonal relationships have the potential to attend higher education and opportunities in innovative careers. Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And feel free to watch any of the other related videos.